I think prep ended.
We haven't ended, I think.
Oh, it's 9:52.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Is grace periods in this tournament?
I don't think so.
Okay. Just hold on. Oh, that's the top. Okay. Everyone ready?
Just give me 1 second.
You want to do introductions? Or...
Can I just get names for all speakers before we start?
Yeah, my name's Aiden Fernandez. I'll be the first and third speaker for Washington.
And then VMS VJ, second speaker, Washington.
Trevor Jacobin, I'll be first and third for on Hillbrook.
Shreyan Jain, second speaker for Hillbrook on the opposition.
As a brief option roadmap, order is going to be one off long and framework at the end if I have time. Are there any questions? Okay.
Let's say that one more time, sorry.
One off long framework at the end if I have time. Any questions? My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Framework interpretation of the role of the values of both the political methodology of estimated patriarchal epistemology. One is not born to know, and knowledge affects power relations. Whose land speaks truth, what even is considered truth. Under capitalism, the ruling class defines reason through mastery and rationality. Exclusion of women, colonies, people, queer voices, construct objectivity, a weapon of control. Example, 19th century medicine defined women's bodies as sterile, justify mass institutionalization and domestic confinement. Erasing social reproduction from economics entirely subpoints. B is that objectivity in the patricial cons, Sarah Hardy proof neutrality, skies the standpoint of dominant colonial anthropology, treated Western observation, scientific and indigenous knowledge, superstition, during the Cold War, U.S. policy schools, modern rational active theory, while ignoring domestic labor and gender violence, erasing social reproduction from economics entirely. Subpoint sees the way replicates the patriarchal epistemology, the form of privileges, adversariality, Evans quantity, flow control, over lived experience, medical regression, competition, give the markers of it, like women debaters who display emotion are treated unserious, reproduce the academic gate, the feminist standpoint, theory reject. Critical understanding first, epistemic approach to feminism becomes a mandatory for capitalism, you and your love assignment of microfriends, use empowerment to entrench dead, debate, state stimulation, teaching exhausting ideology, policy, or practice, co-optation, absent interrogation of patriarchal norms, and they eventually just get combined into other sort of advocacy which removes the base meaning and can turn it against what it was originally meant to do. Debate is key. Debate is where it leads to the reproduced domination. Spreading intensity or not inherently patriarchal direction of knowledge is we repurpose rigorous resistance using feminist methodology to amplify our own meaning in the context of debate. Negation is patriarchal. The negative basically assumes a binary win-lose logic. No matter what they do, they're stuck within the premise that they're going to be rejecting something, which forces them to not have as large of an epistemic break that can be done on the other side. Which means that no matter what they do, even if they take a critical stance against any of us, our things are still going to be meeting their own burden. They're still going to be stuck within the structure of the patriarchal debate. Refusal is key. Refusal of methodological shit that the app is taking. We are refusing to do what the app's burden is, which is thus causing a larger epistemic break than anything that the negation can do, thus giving us further offense. And this methodological break breaks away from the structure of the debate and just creates and breaks it down, thus causing a larger epistemic break. So, onto links. First, superior complex. The resolution forces us to think of ourselves as superiors and the people who know what's in the best interest for another country. This is a patriarchal epistemology in which we assume that it's our job to do something. It's our job to take a higher stance. It's our job that we are dictating the lives of other people while ignoring the fact whether we even should take this assumption as we are superiors. Second is the fact that use of scientific objectivity. The resolution forces us to view nature as a resource to be exploited, separating scientific knowledge from the social and ecological consequences of that knowledge. The scientific supposes the objective approach is used to justify exploitation of women. Extend that the objectivity in the myth and knowledge reflects power relations. Third is that patriarchal assumption. The resolution forces us to assume that it's highly unlikely for oil reserves will become known. This is a form of epistemology that is used to suppress alternatives to patriarchal norm by assuming that any sort of alternative that may have a meaning of solvency is highly unlikely and thus keeps us and forces us to stay in the status quo. On to impacts. First, that on accessibility. Basically, what happens is when you begin to prioritize places in the debate space and certain ways of knowing and certain knowledge, you end up kicking out people who have alternative ways of knowing, and by extension, you begin to only prioritize certain ways and certain people in the debate space, which limits accessibility as people who have alternative ways of thinking aren't prioritized in the debate space. Second is that on educational decay. Basically, the homogenization of education in which when you prioritize prioritize these things, only people begin to look that, hey, if I do A, B, and C, I'm going to get a valid, which means that I'm going to do the same thing again and again and again. And whereas people have alternative ways of knowing, if they want to do it, they're going to not do it under the premise that they're not going to be valued there, which leads to educational decay under the premise that we're homogenizing the things that we're learning out of this. The third is that on epistemic violence. When we begin to take these assumptions, the harmful implications are that people begin to believe these things as true. The fact is that epistemic violence happens when we begin to prioritize what we're knowing, the education that we're gaining out of this, and when we have that, it begins to skew what we think because we believe that things that we learn in debate as functionally true, and things that just might also be true just aren't said in the context of debate, which skews the way we think. Which takes to the alternative. Vote affirmative to enact feminist refusal as an epistemic practice. Multiple points here. First, pre-fiat spillover. We're the prerequisite towards any sort of critical thing. We want to reconstruct debate into a premise where we're able to debate epistemic practice, which means under the premise that they bring up any sort of other critical argument, we're still the prerequisite under the premise that we're essentially turning it into like maybe 1 out of 10 rounds are going to be a tech round in which I'm able to run this, but if we turn it into a place where we're actually debating epistemic practice, then more epistemological things are going to be brought up in the context of a new debate space, thus pitching as the prerequisite to increase the propagation of these ideologies. Second is on material spillover. The things that we learn in debate go out into the real world, look towards policymakers coming out of debate, which means that it's incredibly key. Extended debate is key. Second is that on collaborative organization. We're reconstructing debate essentially to become a collaborative space. Instead of looking at it this versus that, we're going to interrogate as feminist refusal, like the epistemic assumptions that we're taking in the context here, using it as more of a collaborative space rather than simply a this versus that in a binary win-lose logic. Third is that on diversification of knowledge, look towards the fact that when we begin to take these assumptions, multiple other things can come up. If we turn it into a collaborative space, we no longer have any of these issues in which you're just prioritizing. Yeah, sure.
Do you want to win this round?
Yeah, the alt requires that we have. So yeah. And fifth is that on reclamation of rigor, we maintain speed evidence, but we reorient it in order to have some sort of solitude, which thus proves that the debate is broken if we're able to do that. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay. Clarity, accessibility, priority, fairness. Some point A is the only way that you can get fairness in debate is being in debate. Some point B is that it's preferable to have access versus fairness. If it comes out to you compromising fairness versus compromising access, you want to have access under the premise that there are structural and procedural ways to resolve it, thus making it preferable to have access to an unfair debate space under the premise that you can fix it. Second is that structural over procedural. Evidence, time, and neutrality myths are all coded into the debate. The way we resolve material solvency of fairness without interrogating the why behind like what we value. There's no way to even evaluate the material solvency of fairness if we look like why we're valuing some sort of fairness over others, which means that we need to prioritize it, which was the fact that we proved that like it's a patriarchal debate space. Equality in procedures is like functionally a myth. Procedural equality assumes that like there's going to be things such as like there's some sort of equality that we can reach in this round. When in reality, things like the resolution exists. The judge basically defines strategy, which means that all these things and the assumption that we make that we can reach equality is thus impossible to ascertain. Hence, don't evaluate it as a solid link to fairness. Or the affirmative harder than the game. Structure 2 ACs to answer 8 minutes of reactive offense again. 12 minutes to block. If a single arm is in class over 12 minutes and we lose a 5-minute 1 hour can be the block more famous offense. B prep the athletes to train by 20 minutes of research the topic. The negative generic just has a lead every half minutes to check brain say DA every round means you just memorize the content. Reject 1 and C theory. Thinking procedures to debate onto one layer where class shows us on a handful of standards and counter standards. That means the block will stimulus and live lines, especially if you start 6 or 7 minutes behind. We get 2 AC theory. 1 half lets the fairness proves blocks to broken. 2 AC theory spring block necessarily the pure mark B. 2 any half violation justifies the debate since the debate was already unfair against the athlete. 1 NC theory and non-voter 3. We can't cover every instrument of 1 NC breaking infinite 1 NC abuse and its impacts and strategies functioning possible. We get P mark 3. 1 structure times skew. The block in front of the 12 minutes new offense. P more is 5 minutes. Only has 5 minutes. There's no meaningful reciprocal grab. This collapses the golden terms. Obviously, no way short term, but it's collapse full. For reject block arguments to the 1 AC, the block basically can functionally sandbag anything that comes out of the first speech into the last 2 speeches, which means that the 2 AC's work is basically mooted, and on top of that, they can extend a very large line by line skew that the PMR cannot resolve. The underview is that competing interests over any sort of reasonability because otherwise there's no locus of even us going down and setting any norms for debate. We're trying to prioritize these things before they become an abuse. The second thing is that don't let them internalize any sort of impacts towards any of these things because we don't, which means that there's not going to be a reciprocity. They try to do 1 NC voter issue cop outs. For those reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you. Did you give them the copy?
Okay. Preface this week, I haven't really hit Casey before, so.
Oh, we got a story for you after the round.
Oh boy.
Okay. I don't know exactly where I'm going to go with this, but I'll probably go over the Caden theory. Okay. Everybody ready? first of all, we want to just like point out in the resolution that this house as a geologist doesn't define any gender. So we think that like first of all, this geologist could be like first of all, it could be a man or a woman, so it could be anybody in the stars, anybody in the sense. We want to first of all say that like the fact that they kind of like reject us and say that you're like taking power to a patriarchal sense, they could have instead framed this as basically from as a geologist, framing the geologist as a woman, so she can empower herself to make this decision by herself, and like making this as a certain decision. Like we think like first of all, like them taking the stance against like the resolution have any availability to empower women in any sense, probably like means that they're inherently not trying to actually like uphold like this epistemological sense. We think that like they're trying to disrupt this in a way that isn't actually like it's really just like for the sake of like winning the ballot. We think that they're not actually like attempting to dismantle patriarchal epistemology in any way, especially because they like don't attempt to even like frame this topic as something that could be approached and they just inherently reject it whatsoever. We think that this rejection inherently is like what actually skews like which maintains like this patriarchal attitude. We think that like this apology, this way of thinking, completely rejecting the res is probably pretty harmful because you're basically saying that systems that exist have like no way to actually like have solvency from within, and you're basically saying you need to fully disrupt systems. We also think like if you look to real world like on the framework, like you're not just going to completely dismantle the systems by saying think differently. We think that like taking actual action to work from within to dismantle epistemology is probably going to be like the way you resolve a lot of these things, and we think that they don't do this. We think you probably like turn epistemology and probably make it worse by just inherently inherently rejecting like any possibility of solvency from the inside. We think also like that engaging here with like other epistemology, engaging with the resolution is probably like key to non-nihilism, but is a key to like preventing nihilism. We say they probably like end up like presenting a world where this fully epistemology, everybody's screwed in the sense, and there's like perpetual discrimination with no way to work from within, which means that like people have no solvency in the real world, which means everybody probably like ends up thinking that their life is doomed, that there's never going to be any possibility of like people creating a world in which like the geologist is a woman and the woman is empowered to make a decision about the resolution to reveal her discovery. Okay. And so we think that's also like on the link of superior complex. We think that like them like assuming that this resolution feeds in fully into this patriarchal sense and doesn't have a possibility is probably turning like a superior complex. They have a superior complex as well, like rejecting this resolution by just saying like by assuming that their rejection of the resolution in itself is going to be a better way to solve. So we think that like in any way you turn it, they're probably like rejecting any way in creating their own superior complex that is probably patriarchal as well. Like we see patriarchal epistemology often goes to a place where they reject like all sensibility and they reject like they reject senses of like connection in order to go for something that they think is better, something that they think is better to resolve, even when like they actually may not know. We also say that like we also think, on their all, which is basically to vote, act, to enact feminist refusal as an epistemic practice, we think, first of all, what does feminist refusal actually mean? Like, they're just basically, spewing out a bunch of, words here to refuse it as an epistemic practice, but doesn't actually, first of all, solve for much here. We also think, the epistemology is probably flawed here, because, we think that first of all, the fact that they're actually seeking a ballot, they link it to themselves. They're saying that they're trying to dismantle this this binary of win-lose, but yet they're trying to seek a win through their ballot, which probably means that their epistemology is flawed because they're using epistemology to reject something that they're seeking in itself, which means you probably can evaluate. It's probably harmful as well because they're basically creating this mask in which people think that you're resolving this harmful epistemology, but instead utilizing this epistemology to basically mask the solvency. So people are going to think that you're solving for harms against women. Instead, you're actually just masking this with masking it in a way to dismantle the system of win-lose, but they're doing it through the system of win-lose, which is probably worse because now people are seeing that you're going through the way to resolve it that isn't actually good there. Okay, on to theory. Interpretation of the affirmative must unconditionally defend the resolution. The violation is they don't. Standards 1 is tether. Can you write that? Again, the act must unconditionally defend the resolution. Standards 1 is tether. We say that the resolution is the only stasis point in the round. It's the only point of engagement in which people can actually begin to think and prep. We first of all think that tether is super important because it allows people to actually engage with the round and actually have meaningful discussions. On tether, again, 2 we go to truth testing. Everything that they say we have literally no prep. Our full case is based on this geologist. It's not based on on the stuff that they actually dismantle, which means that we have no ability to actually truth test their arguments and see what they're saying, which means that first of all we can't actually understand if what they're saying is if what they're saying is everything that they're saying is fully true in a sense, which means that we can't like always fully engage and understand like this critical understanding if we don't have any background information ourselves to like engage with it. And then also like in terms of like okay, and then two, we think that, again, this is like probably solve the topical version of the app that allows people to engage fully. They basically like give again like they could have just like done this perspective of a woman geologist instead, to try to dismantle like an assumption of that like everything is run on patriarchal systems by empowering the figure of a woman when said as the actor in this resolution. So we think that this probably could have been a framing that probably solves. Okay, we think also three that like switch side probably solves for all of this. They could have run this on like all the runs as the neg, but instead they choose to do it as a gap. We think like switch side is good for a couple reasons. Like first of all, when you have switch side, you're able to like actually understand the arguments from the other side better, so you're not always just running the same thing, which means you can actually probably like better your alt and make everything like make solvency better, so you can by actually like understanding the perspective from the other side, the double perspective is probably better in all senses. And so we think that like switch side is better for education and also like accessibility as well, because then people can come in and they can understand the situation from a side, but then also be able to engage with from the other side. Okay, onto like voters, we like first of all think that like probably we think that like education is probably really important. We have like no ability to actually sorry. I'll go into like a fourth standard ground. Like we literally have no ground to engage with whatsoever in this space. Like inherently, all our fairness is skewed procedurally, just because we have like no ability to engage with anything, because we literally have like nothing prepped for an AFK, especially in like a kind of value round. Okay, first of all, on the underview, like. We think that procedural fairness probably comes before everything. We think that like procedural fairness actually is the most important thing, because it's what allows for people to like gain access to space to actually like engage with it. They say like accessibility comes over procedural fairness, but accessibility inherently just means that people are there. We think accessibility probably isn't good always, because if you're putting them into a space which is procedurally skewed, that means you're always putting people into a space that's probably like skewed against them. That's probably going to hurt them. For example, like putting a woman into a space that is like procedurally skewed probably means you're just basically forcing them into a space where they're always oppressed and where they're always in and where they're always have no way to break out of it. We think that solving for procedural fairness inside of a space is a prerequisite for accessibility actually being a good thing, which means that you probably need to resolve for like accessibility first, which means that you probably need everybody to like to make sure that like everything is procedurally accessible, to make sure that there's a system that people can come into to then actually like have a voice. Otherwise, you're just giving an illusion of accessibility, saying you're actually joining, but they actually have no voice. And we see this parallel as well, like within this like epistemology in the real world from patriarchy. They like men include women without actually without actually hearing their voices, simply just say that they're like accessing this space, even though they're not actually like in a place that's like procedurally fair. We think how establishing a procedurally fair like space in debate is probably like a key to resolving like a lot of feminist harms as well. Okay, we think first of all like theory comes before all. You must like defend the rules of the space before you debate it. Just because like otherwise there's literally no space that exists, and again like you have no accessibility there too. To drop the debater, like deter future views and deter they're literally using us right now. We think that like they won't ever learn from this. They'll keep engaging in this if you don't drop them. We also think like probably we also think that probably counter-interpretation come up reasonably minimize judge intervention here. And yeah. Okay.
Okay. Alright, so again, VMS VJ, Op 2 speaker from Washington. This speech, I'm just going to go same order as last speaker, just responses. Any questions? Okay. Then time will begin in 3, 2, 1. First of all, they tell you that this geologist could be any gender, and that therefore, like, there's a version of the app where, you know, we could have, like, just engage with the topic and not have to run this critique. But we tell you, first of all, this is still using patriarchal epistemology, which is proven by the links. This really has very, very little to do with gender. Just because the geologist is a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. They're still using patriarchal epistemology, and that's proven with our links. I would also like to point out that the last two links that we give you are conceded. The first link of use of scientific objectivity, we tell you the resolution forces us to view nature as a resource to be exploited. They're separating scientific knowledge from the actual social and ecological consequences of that knowledge, and this they use this supposedly objective approach, which has been used to justify exploitation of women, and extend again from the critique that objectivity is a myth and knowledge reflects power relations. Therefore, they're still using patriarchal epistemology. Yeah, and then the second link that they concede here is on patriarchal assumptions. Yeah, this right. the resolution forces us to assume it's highly unlikely that oil reserves will become known, and this form of epistemology is used to suppress alternatives to patriarchal norms by assuming they're highly unlikely. So they concede both of these links, flows through to the end of the debate, and again, don't allow response to the 1AC in later speeches. I'll get to why that is true at the end, but yeah, just don't let any response to these in future speeches. Okay, next. They tell you we could have used this resolution to combat patriarchy in some way, but they don't give a real example of a topical version of the app. They don't tell you how exactly we could have done that. The closest they get to doing that is by saying that, the geologist could be any gender, but again, that doesn't actually interact with their arguments at all, really, because we're not talking about the gender of the geologist here. We're talking about the patriarchal epistemology used that the resolution forces us to think through when we're engaging with the resolution. Next, they tell you that we're making this worse by not working from within the debate space, and because we're rejecting the resolution, that's creating more harms in the space. But we tell you we are working within the debate space. We're saying debate is key. We're here. We're trying to create a collaborative debate space. We're trying to improve the debate space. We are actually solving for this from within. Next, they tell you our rejection of the resolution shows our superiority complex. Where we're telling you.
We refuse to debate the resolution entirely.
Yeah,
we refuse to take the superior complex to anyone rather than just.
Yeah. So yeah, we're refusing the resolution completely. We're not taking any sort of superiority complex in the context of this debate. Next, they tell you that we're rejecting senses of connection in the space. We tell you we're creating a more. What was that?
A POI.
Yeah.
Is your alt not your assumption that that's your way of solving this harm?
Sure. Yeah, we're saying creating a more collaborative debate space and using the alt is better than the status quo of the debate space. Okay, next they tell you that we're rejecting sensitive connection. We're telling you that we're creating a more collaborative debate space, which creates more connection in the space. Next they tell you, they tell you that we're trying to seek the win through the ballot, right? They're saying that we're basically contradicting our own case by trying to seek the win. They concede a couple of things here which explain why this is. First of all, we tell you reclamation of rigor. We tell you that we use speed and we're asking for the ballot of the judge in order to get rid of this patriarchal epistemology. So we're using it for a greater goal, essentially. We also tell you, the judge's vote makes people more likely to run the case. If people see this round and they see, okay, this argument wins rounds, they're going to be more likely to run it, and we're going to get closer and closer to that actual collaborative debate space that we want, closer to the alt actually occurring. So we're using the debate space here in order, again, debate is key. We're using the space here in order to create larger changes that have ripple effects throughout the entire space and create larger impacts of greater magnitude. Okay, also on the superiority complex, we tell you that the fiated, this bad fiated tense of superiority complex is bad. We don't take a superiority complex by assuming to a procedural action, but by resolving a structural issue and let them do their own thing. This leads to pre-fiat spillover, again, from the critique in the very first speech. Pre-fiat spillover, just extend that. Okay. Yeah, so, that's the response to trying to seek the win through the ballot. Okay, next on this theory shell, a couple of responses here, right? First of all is just completely extend the hedge, the framework argument that we gave you in the very first speech. They shouldn't be allowed to have theory here because we tell you that affirming is harder than negating. Extend all of the all of the justification we give you for that. They tell you the first standard, but even so, I'm going to respond line by line to this this theory. First of all, they tell you tether. They tell you that the only locus of offense basically should be the resolution. We tell you we're showing links between the resolution and our critique, so we're using the resolution to create offense here. Next, they tell you. Switch side debate. We tell you so on switch side debate, we tell you the negation is inherently patriarchal. Extend this completely. We tell you in the very first speech, and this goes conceded, that negation is inherently patriarchal. We tell you we're trying to create a larger epistemic rupture here. The goal here is to create a huge epistemic rupture, and the affirmative rejecting the resolution is more of an epistemic rupture than the negation rejecting the resolution. Therefore, we cannot do this on the other side of the ground here. We can only do this on app.
Can you say again why neg is inherently patriarchal?
Yeah, so they're using the constant need to win, masculine coded reasoning, masculine coded logic, and basically they're still playing within the rules, they're playing within the game, right? Basically we're saying if the negation were to reject, they're still negating the affirmative, which is still part of the debate rules, basically, right? They're not creating a larger epistemic rupture. We're creating a larger epistemic rupture because as AF, we're completely rejecting this game of, the current status quo game of debate to create something completely different. On the standard of truth testing, we can't test anything in parliamentary debate. Also, you aren't interacting with us despite us linking to the resolution. This is a term here. Okay, next. They tell you about procedural fairness and how you should be weighing procedural fairness like super high here. We tell you structural fairness over procedural fairness. Just extend our arguments in the very first speech. We tell you that no procedure is truly fair. We tell you equality in procedures just doesn't exist. This doesn't go responded to. You can't have true equality in procedures ever in any sort of competitive space like this. So structural fairness goes above procedural fairness. And basically the layering that's going on here is at the very, very top you have accessibility. We tell you accessibility is a priori to any kind of fairness, any kind of education or anything, right? Because you need to be in the space in the first place. We also tell you there's no point in having a fair procedure that creates patriarchal epistemology, right? If it's a procedure that is inherently bad, if it's we prove to you that the status quo debate space creates policymakers who have who use patriarchal epistemology, then it's not good to be defending that procedure. You should be creating the accessibility so that you can have a better procedure in the first place and then solve for that procedural fairness. We also tell you that you need accessibility to space in order to even get any benefits from the procedural fairness in the first place, right? So accessibility goes at the very top. We create huge magnitudes of accessibility by allowing marginalized groups to enter the debate space as a collaborative space. So at the very top we win on accessibility, then on structural fairness we win that, and then on procedural fairness. They tell you that putting people in the skewed space is bad. Firstly, we solve for the skew in the status quo. Second, accessibility outweighs. We also have impacts on fairness. You can fix fairness, but you can't fix accessibility if you're not in the space in the first place. Also, extend the hedge completely. Extend all of the arguments there goes unresponded to, and extend links, impacts, alt solvency, everything on the K. For those reasons, vote neg.
So my speech order is going to be just maybe a quick, okay, I'll go over theory first, and then if I have time left, I'll get to the K. Okay. Time starts now. Okay. The affirmative doesn't engage with the procedural stuff at all. They basically just say that procedural fairness is, no procedure is ever truly fair. They don't explain why access by itself actually solves. If you have access but no real voice, no real procedural fairness, it just creates the illusion of accessibility and doesn't actually let people spread their voice anywhere. If you don't have procedural fairness, then debate also collapses because the game relies on people being able to win. If people can't actually win or lose based on what happens in the round, then there's no fairness left in the space. And if debate collapses, then their entire K is, their entire solvency is gone because they say that debate is key in order to spread their epistemology. If they have no way to spread their epistemology, then there's no real solvency, which is why the theory goes above the K, because you need procedural fairness in order to even spread the K or to spread epistemology by itself. You need the kind of access that is created by having procedural fairness for marginalized debaters to even spread their kinds of epistemology or to even be able to access the debate space in a meaningful way. They say that they let marginalized debaters into the debate space to participate on the same level as everybody else, but what that participation means on its own is nothing if they don't actually have procedural fairness to compete with everybody else. So procedural fairness is the most important thing. Also, extend our counterinterprets over reasonability, and also note that they don't provide any counterinterpret to this theory shell, so they assume our interpretation is true, and they don't meet because they provided a non-topical, they didn't actually unconditionally defend the resolution. They say that they have links through, and they use the resolution for offense, but this isn't unconditionally defending the resolution. They tell us themselves that they reject the resolution, which means that they are inherently not meeting our counterinterpretation, our interpretation. So extend all of our standards, extend that a topical version of the act could solve by doing this, having the geologist framed as a woman, and thus also rejecting the epistemology of patriarchal control. Assuming it would be a man is actually reinforcing patriarchal epistemology by assuming that any kind of powerful position is masculine and assuming that masculine logic is necessary to make these kinds of decisions. As to say that there is no solvency for switching sides because they're trying to create an epistemic rupture by doing this as the affirmative, and that neg would still be negating the app. It's true, we agree that an epistemic rupture is created by the affirmative, but we believe this epistemic rupture leads to debate collapse because it ruins procedural fairness. It lets them just do whatever they want and get the ballot without actually engaging with the real case or the negations arguments at all. Basically, it means that we are skewed out of the round, which means that procedural fairness goes away in this round, which ultimately, if they continue doing this, leads to debate collapse because procedural fairness goes away forever. Remember, we're not only trying to deter prevent abuse in this round, but also prevent future abuse in the future, which means that procedural fairness has to be preserved for all of debate. If we don't have the debate space, then their debate collapses because they say debate is key themselves. There's also a larger rupture when they make their alt better than just voting for them, because then we're actually engaging with solvency. If their alt is just to vote for them, then it still works within the debate space. It still works within the same win-lose binary that they tell us is bad and reinforces patriarchal epistemology. You cannot solve for that epistemology by working within that epistemology, as they say. Like, if you're just solving by voting for the AF, then that is a bad alt compared to other alternative alts. If they have a better alt, then you can solve the patriarchal epistemology better than just a vote for the affirmative being a way to solve for patriarchal epistemology. You're still working within the same win-lose binary by voting for the affirmative. So you should prefer vote for the negative in order to preserve procedural fairness in debate, and vote for framework theory over the K. Extend our standard of ground. They don't engage with this at all because we have no grounds in this debate. Procedural fairness is like, there's proven abuse, and the lack of grounds means that we are automatically winning that theory shell. We believe that you should be weighing this framework theory over everything else. On the affirmative K, basically they respond by saying that their patriarchal epistemology links prove that the geologist being a woman would not have alt solvency. They don't really engage with like the fact that they're like, okay, so the scientific objectivity and access epistemology things, they're both relying on this idea that rejecting the resolution entirely actually makes debate collaborative and like helps reject these frameworks. Okay, sorry, just scratch that. On to the, what should I say? Oh yeah, affirming would mean they're not revealing the oil reserves at all, which actually delinks their entire case. Their entire case relies on this idea that scientific objectivity and that nature is meant to be exploited, when the entire affirmative resolution in the first place, if they affirm the resolution, would be actually affirming that nature is not meant to be exploited, that you shouldn't just reveal the oil reserves. There is no real link here. You can delink the entire scientific objectivity link entirely, and the access link and different ways of knowledge being prioritized. There's no, and how there's, it's used to suppress alternative ideas, that there's only one way for this to work, and that the oil reserves wouldn't be found in any other way. This is actually, this just kind of isn't really true. It's just a constraint of the resolution that it's unlikely. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen in the first place. It doesn't automatically mean that every alternative idea is bad. It doesn't automatically mean that not revealing the oil reserves would mean there is no chance of them ever being found. It just means that you're trying to prioritize based on one way or another what would be the best outcome. There's no reason that alternative ideas are just automatically suppressed here. Also, they make it, remember the AFK rejects the resolution, which would actually be better for resolving nature being exploitable. It would be better for resolving the idea that nature can be exploited if they defend the resolution unconditionally. So their can be delinked from, their K can be delinked from the resolution that way. So delink it that way. On the they run a shell in their first block about why theory is automatically bad if the op runs it, and how it's harder to be af than neg. Note that basically most rounds, the entire concept of procedural fairness should be weighed above this idea. If you always automatically vote for the AF because it's harder to be AF than neg, then you lead to total debate collapse because neg can never win, and neg becomes impossible to win on. If neg is impossible to win on, then there is no procedural fairness left. There is no reason to participate in debate as an activity if your win or loss is just decided by whichever side you're assigned before the round, and that leads to debate collapse, which is the most important thing in this round, because it means that there is no debate space for the spread of their epistemology in the first place, and there is no ability to have accessibility in the first place if you are just automatically collapsing every round into AF winning. If AF is harder than neg and you're always voting for AF if neg wins theory, then there is no way for neg to deal with abuse at all, and because if abuse continues to happen in the debate space, debate collapses. This is more important than the idea that AF is just harder than neg and the op shouldn't be allowed to run theory. Also, on the idea that if we should drop op if they make any arguments in the block, there's no real reason to drop the entire opposition case for that. It's just the reason there are constructive speeches by the norms of debate is so that the opposition can make new arguments during the MO. Also, back to the alt. the most important thing to consider here is that the alt is using wins to dismantle the binary of wins and losses. You cannot dismantle the binary of wins and losses just by giving a vote to the affirmative, giving them a win or a loss. You're working within the system either way, and this is no real way to dismantle the system. They're basically telling us that they both cannot dismantle the system by working within the system, while at the same time trying to use a vote for the affirmative as a way to dismantle the win-loss binary. This doesn't solve at all, and you should be weighing theory over all of this because we were skewed out of the round in this case. There's proven abuse. They rejected the resolution, which is a violation of our interpretation. This directly means that they are leading to the collapse of the debate space by basically skewing negation out of the debate space permanently. Because of that skew and that epistemic rupture that they say they create, they are causing a lack of procedural fairness, which means there will be no opportunity for this regular epistemology in the first place. Their K both doesn't have actual solvency for their epistemology because they are using wins and losses in order to try to dismantle the win-loss binary, which inherently means they have no solvency since they're reinforcing that same binary while asking you to vote for their K. And because framework theory declares above all, we believe you should be voting for the negative prioritized procedural fairness and create access to debate space. Rejecting the resolution as a whole is actually affirming the superiority complex that their rejection has some kind of major impact and solves for patriarchy, which is itself a kind of superiority complex. Yeah, thank you.
I'll probably just be going over like theory and the K. Everyone ready? Great. Okay. The first thing you're looking to in this round is procedural fairness, because again, you must have a space that actually has like at least simulated fairness before accessibility begins to mean anything whatsoever. They don't engage with this at all. They basically just say like, no, accessibility matters between people in the city. They don't actually engage with the warranting, in which like procedural fairness being skewed even more creates more oppressive spaces in which when people come into them, they're like inherently like unable to access the space as a whole, which means that you're probably going to procedural fairness first, which means that like they probably extend this, don't let them respond to this. So we say like this illusion of accessibility when you have like procedural fairness, just because like procedural is like perpetually like there's no possibility of actual procedural fairness doesn't mean you try to create a space that is equal at all. Again, like if you say the procedural fairness and like this illusion of like equality is like never going to be real, that also means that like that like possible like gender equality and like stuff isn't possible at all. We think this is like really harmful. Again, you're trying to work towards like creating the most possibly fair space that you can, just as you're working to create the most possibly like equal place in the world that you can for everybody that exists within it. We think that like that them saying like it's perpetually like unable to be exactly the beginning doesn't mean that you don't work towards procedural fairness first to make the space as inclusive and as a good space for people to actually access in the first place. Again, like this is super important. And also the second point of procedural fairness is that like if you don't have fairness, people are going to like end up leaving debate, which means the debate collapse, which means they have like no solvency on anything. There's no solvency on the K or anything. So the theory comes over K here because they can't access anything like they're all again without theory and without the space existing. The norms come first before you can even talk about using the space for solvency, because the space must exist in the first place. Again, like and
POO stop time. K over T layering was brought up in my first speech, so the second speaker could have.
we have given T over K layering throughout.
Okay, so
Okay.
judge's discretion though.
Okay.
On that.
I'll resume 3, 2, 1. Okay, and second, also extend like they give no counter interpretation, which means you assume their interpretation is true, and we also like extend our standards of ground like outweigh there. We have literally no ground that's like completely procedural fairness here. Like we have no ability to engage because they don't do anything there. We also tell you switch side solves in a couple ways because like first of all they can actually like create a better rupture with better alt if they actually like choose to engage from the perspective of the affirmative to understand what they're actually critiquing in this case, which means that they're probably going to like create better rupture in a case where we have switch side debate, which means that we probably have like a better world with this anyways as well. Okay, we also tell you like on tether, like they tell you that they're like using the resolution, but we also the resolution to create links, but we say that like inherently they say they're rejecting the resolution, yet they say that they're like tethered to the resolution because they're using links to it. So which one are they? Are they actually like fully rejecting the resolution, or are they like basically giving you an illusion of rejecting the resolution to instead use the resolution? We think that this completely contradicts what they're saying within themselves, which means they're probably either not rejecting the resolution, which means that you probably don't buy the epistemology of their whole K, or they are actually using resolution, which means that they're like which means they're linking into the K that they give you as well, which means they're probably like using the space and the epistemology of the space instead that they're trying to critique. We think that this is kind of a double bind. There's no way out here. So kind of like cross apply that Frank gets from T to K or something like that. Okay, and so like we think again, like drop the debater. There's proven abuse and future abuse for like for if they use in the future. The only way they're going to learn is if you drop them. And this is what you need to do as well, because you assume the theory shell is probably true, and you probably layer some of everything. You go there, and that's why you're dropping them. Okay, and also on the K. Okay, so on the K. There's a few things. The first point is that they're actually using a win to dismantle this binary of win losses. We think that like if they're trying to like basically give this illusion of dismantling the space by using this binary within the space, they're probably not going to dismantle it. We think their epistemology is flawed and actually feeds and links back into their K, which means that they probably make the space worse by by perpetuating the win-loss binary in this instance. We also think that second, we think to have a larger superior complex by completely rejecting resolution. Extend as well, extend this as well about how like men often reject women's like perspectives here because it has a superior complex as a whole instead of using the space to like give them a voice. So we think that procedural fairness comes overall, like the possible TVA of using a woman as a geologist to frame her as having power against the patriarchy is also like something that they could have done as well. We think that like they link back into their K, and we think you turn the K, but we think you vote on the T in procedural fairness first.
Okay. All right, order's gonna be just voter issue and then hedge KT, or no, hedge TK. Yeah, voter issue, hedge TK. Okay, any questions? Okay, and my time starts in 3, 2, 1. Judge, you should be voting off the accessibility impact of the critique provided. But before we get into that, let's start on the hedge. First, the hedge was implicitly conceded from the first speech. Multiple implications of this. First, by the fact that the framework goes above any other thing, because the only reason that any sort of argument in the debate space even gains any sort of offense is because there's a framing argument. They ran a framing argument for their T, we ran a framing argument for our thing, which means that framework is above everything else. Second, don't fall into the cyclical nature as to whether you should evaluate things that come up later under the premise that they've already conceded it. What I mean by that is that they give you block responses as to how they should get block responses, but we give you earlier responses as to how they shouldn't get block responses, presumably earlier on the premise that we have a better debate space and they're not sandbagging, the very thing that our hedge indicts that they're going to be sandbagging, which means that they're doing exactly what the hedge says. Third is the fact that they don't provide any sort of competing inter, which is what the hedge explicitly said, that you need to provide an alternative way in order to go down towards the other forms, which means that the hedge, even any sort of response they make, because they don't provide any sort of other way for the judge to resolve it, the only rules that you were provided with is our own, and that's also something that they themselves show as explicitly conceded, because my partner, did not provide a competing interpretation for some reason, okay, which means that they also agree that competing interpretations are key, since the hedge is explicitly conceded. Now, what are the implications of the hedge? It means that A, they are not allowed to bring up new arguments to the 1AC in the block. There's multiple new arguments they bring up, and I advise you not to evaluate it. Second, don't intervene onto this premise, because otherwise it hurts any sort of debatability that we're gonna have in the debate space if you start to intervene on any sort of place like that. So probably just drop any new arguments that come out of the block because of that. The second implication is that reject 1NC theory, the line by line was explicitly conceded. They don't provide any other thing, which means that evaluating you should just simply reject 1NC theory under the premise that it's the only thing that's shown to resolve the line by line issue that is created. When they created, we're already at a disadvantage here. Third is the fact that they concede the other argument on how equality and procedures don't exist, and by extension you shouldn't evaluate it as solvent linked to fairness, something that came up in the very first speech, another argument as to why you should evaluate theory that they did not read. Fourth is the fact that we get PMR theory, but we'll see at the end what happens. That, and also, and there was also we get 2AC theory, but we didn't read 2AC theory. Okay, that takes us down to the theory shell. The theory shell should basically not be, so the hedge gets cross-examined down to the theory shell. Essentially, the theory shell should not be evaluated. There's two major things that you're going to be weighing on this route. Whether you should evaluate accessibility or whether you should evaluate procedural fairness. We would argue that the work that has gone down into how to specifically procedural fairness should not be evaluated if it comes from theory shell, as well as procedures, or comes from a 1NC theory shell, or the fact that procedures in itself takes an assumption that you can't make, and hence don't evaluate it as a solvent link, proves that procedures in debate doesn't exist. However, even if you don't, by the fact that there is no semblance of procedural fairness in the debate, even if you value that procedural fairness is the most important thing in this round, Judge, we would argue that they don't even have any sort of procedural offense under the premise that there is no theory shell in this round that you should evaluate, which means the procedural thing doesn't go down. Next, on to the fact of the critique. They attempt to turn the critique on to say that we're perpetuating the binary with a new argument on the win. We'd argue that, first of all, it's a new argument, which means that you shouldn't evaluate it. We'd argue that the epistemic rupture, that saying that we're trying to use the debate space in order to we're using the debate space to get a win. We'd argue there's multiple responses. This first, from the very first speech, the reclamation of rigor analysis I gave you in the very first speech, how we use the patriarchal norms in order to indict it in itself, was explicitly conceded from the first speech. My partner extended it, so you can take it to the end of the speech, in which we explicitly say that even though we're operating in it, we're still rejecting it. Even though we're using the spreading and density and all these other things that are patriarchal norms, we're using it to reject it, which was explicitly conceded, which resolves the issue as to whether we're linking into ourselves, because they don't respond to that argument entirely, which means that we're taken out of that. Next, onto this weighing argument onto how procedural fairness or accessibility. We'd argue that we're ahead on accessibility under the premise that my argument that I came up in the very first speech is conceded, being that yes, you're going to be compromising something, right? You take accessibility, you can compromise procedural fairness, but I tell you explicitly why accessibility should be taken above procedural fairness, because you cannot fix that. The very fact that they're running a theory shell in their speeches shows that there's a way to increase fairness. They are attempting to increase fairness in the debate space. However, accessibility, no matter what happens in this debate space, we're not going to increase the amount of people that are happening in the debate space right now. There's going to suddenly be like 10 people walking into this room and saying, hey, I joined the debate space as a result of this round. No, Judge, what we tell you is that the procedures and structural ways that have already in debate, which helps us increase it. However, there's things such as accessibility which aren't as easy to resolve, which creates this norm in which that people are just permanently kicked out. Finally, we argue that we're the only side ahead on that under the premise that they don't impact out to accessibility, which means you should buy the fact that accessibility is a more important thing in this round under the premise that it's more difficult to have any sort of solvency, as well as the meta-weighing analysis that came out in the very first speech as to how it should be valued above. Because even if you're compromising one over the other, it's easier to resolve and increase fairness in debate than it is to increase accessibility in debate, which demonstrates how it's going to do it. Like, the argument as to how, one compromises the other was brought in the very first speech, we argue that's not. Which means you should vote off of the accessibility, vote off of the two links that were conceded. They don't explain the implications of the superiority complex, so we argue that we have two links versus their one, which means that we outweigh and go down onto the impact of accessibility and vote off accessibility as a primary impact. For those reasons, I vote an affirmative ballot. Thank you. Alright. Good debate.
Mind if we go outside?
Yeah, exactly.